Sawadee Krap and welcome to another episode here for the Flagrant Pod, Mindful Media and Communication. And today we're dissecting one of the biggest podcasts in the world. We're dissecting the Flagrant Podcast with Akash Singh, Andrew Schulz, Mark Agnew, and Alex Media. Flagrant Podcast. If you don't know the Flagrant Podcast, but you know mine, then you're my favorite person. So for those who don't know, the Flagrant Podcast started as Flagrant 2 Podcast back then with like Andrew Schulz and Akash Singh, two stand-up comedians. And they talked about sports. That's why they call it Flagrant 2. Flagrant 2 is a call from basketball. When you foul someone like hard, it's a flagrant foul. If you foul someone really hard, it's a Flagrant 2 and you get suspended. So we're going hard in the paint. We're talking lots of sports. Then it developed, blew up into like a huge podcast talking about anything, not just sports, and having guests and so on. So then that's when they rebranded into just Flagrant because they want to be flagrant and not holding back and having lots of celebrity guests, have a huge studio now, a huge production value, and so on. Okay, so that's in a nutshell the Flagrant Podcast. Okay, so I will be dissecting the communication style of the Flagrant Podcast. So not only Andrew Schulz, maybe that's a different episode down the road. I focus on like all the participants, like step by step by step. And then I'm going to try to put it together, bring it together, like how the group communicates, and then maybe come to a conclusion down the road to see how's it going, where will it go, and so on. Okay? So let's jump right into it. With the main man, Andrew Schulz. Andrew Schulz Flagrant with Akash Singh. I think that's how they brand it, right? So Andrew Schulz is the main guy. Obviously, he's the provocateur, if you will, the driving force, the guy who is on Adderall. That's what he said in the last episode, like apparently all the time. The guys just keep talking, and then like has epiphanies all of a sudden, like, oh my God, and then listen to me, guys, listen to me. It's like very extroverted, very outgoing, like lots of movements, like body language wise, like look at me, like I have this idea, and so on. Okay, so that is Andrew Schulz. So clearly the driving force and the main character, because he's the most famous comedian on the podcast. So his communication style, I want to say, is like characterized by like very direct, very assertive, and very often a very, very provocative approach, which is on purpose, of course. Like he wants to provoke to get like a reaction out of the audience, obviously. And while doing so, obviously, he relies on his like stand-up comedy skills to engage and maybe even challenge both like guests, if there are guests, and listeners. Less and less guests these days, though. I'm not sure why. Maybe I am, and we talk about it later. But he wants, of course, engagement, right? And for a while, when the podcast was still growing and booming, did a great job. Like during the pandemic, that's when Andrew Schulz and the podcast blew up like crazy, right? You might have seen like his social posts where he was like, hey, turn your phone sideways real quick, turn your phone sideways. And then they just would explain more in the format. Was just a nice way to get some engagement and so on. It was pretty smart. And then he had Schulz Saves America, like this short episodic show. They would talk about current issues. So he blew up, and so the podcast too, like over the pandemic, very, very quickly, I think, and maybe that hinders them a little bit right now as well. But back to the communication approach, right? So heavily relying on his stand-up comedy skills. They say they don't want to be serious. It's just like Joe Rogan. They're like, hey, we're comedians. Don't take us too serious. We're here to have fun. We're here to chill with the boys, hang out with the boys, and just talk trash. Okay. The theories that we can see that are at use here, probably subconsciously, and I don't think that Andrew Schulz sits down and thinks like, I'm going to use the user gratification theory right here, but he's using it, okay? Because Schulz clearly fulfills like audience desires for entertainment, interaction, personal connection. Like he shares a lot about his private life without like the nitty-gritty details, but he shares a lot about like how he got engaged and married, his wife, his kid. They posted a picture about like his baby already, I think. So he's sharing a lot, which then of course also leads to like a tight personal connection. Okay. So user gratification, entertainment, interaction, connection. That's what he focuses on. And also being flagrant, right? Because the audience is longing for this in a time of political correctness, wokeness, and so on. I'm not going down that road again. We had an episode on that already. But he wants to be like non-PC on purpose. And that's what the audience, his audience, the podcast comedy audience relates to like, yeah, you say it how it is. Ooh, Schulze is so funny. That used to be the comments. Now the comments changed a little. But so definitely using the use and gratification theory. Another one that we can see here, and I try to have like 2 theories per member, so to not to blow it out of proportion too much, that episode right now. The one that we didn't talk about yet, and so I'm going to slow it down here, is a theory we call in communication studies interaction adaptation theory. Okay? That means like in this specific example, how Andrew Schulze adjusts his communicative approach based on guest responses and the engagement. Like in this case, guest engagement. You can, if you look in this stand-up comedy, you could also see like in terms of audience engagement when he does crowd work. He also adjusts his communication style, but then more on this and maybe the separate Andrew Schulze episode. In the podcast episode right now that we're doing today, so when the guest responds in a certain way, like the guest is like a bit more like holding back, like doesn't engage in the topic too much, and Schulze changes his communication style. If he sees he offends someone, he might change the communication style. Either he's holding or turning it down, or if it's a friend or someone they consider a friend, like Whitney Cummings, for example, then they double down and be like extra mean, for example. But in this case, Andrew Schulze, he changes his communication style depending on the guest and the reaction that the guest shows. And that's how they then change their communication style. Okay, so that's the interaction adaptation theory. Okay, so you change your communication style based on the reaction that you're getting. Okay, makes sense. Okay, so that's like the main. I think when if they have guests, then Schulze is like the main driving force in terms of talking points. They're very engaged usually until the Adderall wears off. Then you sometimes see him slipping and he's just sitting there like, and he's the one with the most provocative takes usually. The one with the least, or not least, or less provocative takes is then Akash Singh, the co-host. Yeah, so he's also a stand-up comedian. And he's like that counterbalance, like who tries to provide different viewpoints, sometimes also cultural insights, because he's like the Asian dude, Indian, right? Indian American. So obviously, I mean, I'm not saying they have it like as a DEI thing. I think that's what's it called in the US, right? Diversity thing. Not at all. They've been friends forever, obviously. But obviously, he also brings a different viewpoint to the table, okay? Which is a good thing. And his communication style is also like a little bit different to Andrew Schulze's communication style. Like, of course, he uses humor too, but like also his stand-up comedy has like lots of cultural observations being Indian American, right? So he, of course, sees things a little bit differently based on his heritage. Like, for example, Andrew Schulze, the white guy. Yeah? So there are different viewpoints that he brings to the table, which is a nice thing. So, and he blends like those cultural observations into like lots of his takes on the podcast as well, which then in return, of course, also helps to include like a more diverse audience to watch the podcast or to listen to the podcast. So that's definitely smart here. Like I said, they've been together for a long time. Oh, it's romantic. They've been together for a long time. So he's also, of course, not being pissy or holding back. He just has different angles when he tries to be flagrant, and Schulze clearly the driving force, while Akash Singh like sits back a little, but adds something, usually playing off Andrew Schulze's takes. Yeah, so he's not like counteracting those takes. I think like very often he kind of like takes them a little bit further, or takes them into a different direction, but very often he uses Andrew Schulze's takes to then add something to them. Sometimes he does fact check him, but it doesn't happen too often, I think. Do I say that Akash Singh doesn't have that many own unique thoughts? No. Just saying like they're playing well together in sports terms, since it's the Flagrant Podcast. The theories that I noted down for those, I mean, obviously also using gratification and so on, what we had before, but just to add a few new ones. One we had in our episode before is a social identity theory. I think that fits very well here with Akash, because different audiences can connect with him. If someone doesn't connect with Schulze, because he's loud and brash and like the typical white American dude, then maybe you can connect to Akash Singh, who's a little bit, not the white American dude, he's Indian American, but not just the ethnicity, but also like he's a little bit more self-deprecating, for example, than Schultz. And like he always makes fun of himself being short, for example, and things like that. So maybe then you can relate to this personality a little bit better than to the Schultz personality. Okay? So it's actually smart to have like those lots of different identities at the podcast so that your audience can figure out like who do we connect to the most. And the second theory that I think also makes sense here is the cultural proximity theory. Okay, because he makes lots of cultural references in his stand-up, but also during the podcast, of course. And then to piggyback on like the social identity theory, like the cultural proximity, the proximity to your own culture, maybe to what you have experienced, helps to then also increase the relatability and engagement with the audience. So that's definitely a smart move there. Okay, then the third member of the team is Mark Gagnon. Also, he's I think just half the age of everybody else. He's the youngest member, and he's got a very key role in my opinion because he's kind of like the moderator. He does add his own ideas, thoughts, and so on, but he keeps track of everything. He always has like a laptop on his lap and just checking like what everyone's saying and what they're talking about, fact checking a little bit of fact checking here and there, driving the conversations, making sure they're not getting stuck at certain topics when Schultz just keeps rambling, then Mark sometimes like funny, but they'll make sure everyone's moving on and so on. So he's kind of like the moderator, which is a very important thing to have in this podcast, because otherwise Schultz might just get lost every single episode in his thoughts and with his epiphanies that he has all the time. So he's got a very key role in moderating and also like balancing the dynamics between like the members and like tries to make sure that the flow is like a bit more cohesive if that's actually possible. Even though he's a stand-up comedian by himself and he adds like lots of funny takes actually, I think, to the topics, he also very often has like a more measured and a more reflective communication style. Still being funny and adding like funny takes here and there, but oftentimes being more reflective than the others. The others just go for the hard takes, and also with guests there, then Mark tries to, find a coherent way to weave it together and then to move on, or just make a stupid joke and just be like, okay, stupid joke, and now just move on, which is also like a form of communication, of course. And sometimes if there's no other way out, right, you're like, okay, we're talking about this for the last 10 minutes now, that stupid thing, and then moving on. Also a way of moderating things. So he's definitely stuck up in the moderator role, not in a negative way, probably enjoys that, because you don't have to be the one with all the crazy takes, and you get to be like friendly with the guests and everything. So I think that's probably a nice position to be in. And so he's trying to help navigate those discussions and smooth over conflicts here and there if possible. The theories I noted for Mark, besides all the others, of course, all the theories apply to everybody, right? So everyone using different communication styles in different ways. So all the theories apply in different ways to, of course, everybody there. I think one theory here, though, is quite easy to see, which is the gatekeeping theory. Because Mark is kind of like the filter of the team, so to speak, because he filters and selects like certain discussion topics, which influences the podcast direction. Now, of course, since a few weeks back, they have like this new approach that they think we don't realize, that every team member researches one topic and then they present it to the rest of the team and then they react to it. It's like a high school project, like you do this, you do that, and then we just compare notes. But he's still, I think he's still the one who does like the most research overall for his topic, but probably also for the other topic, just so that he knows like when to move on, when to make sure, okay, now I see that we're stuck and we're changing directions and so on. So I think gatekeeping theory fits very well to Mark here, and also one of the theories that we discussed a few times over the past few episodes, because I still think it's not been discussed enough on media podcasts, which is the ELM, the elaboration likelihood model, because he usually encourages like deeper thought. If there's one on the podcast that encourages deeper thought, it might be marked. So not usually. I'm not saying they never encourage deeper thought, but it's not like the go-to call to action. But if there's one on the podcast that encourages deeper thought and has some takes that have layers to it, and you're like, oh no, maybe I have to think about it, then it might be Mark. Okay. So he frames arguments and discussions in like more logical and more structured manner than maybe Schultz or Singh, because they're going for the provocation. They're like, what? And trying to make people go like, what the hell? And then Mark's there and he adds like some layers to it. You're like, oh, okay. He structures the thoughts now. He explains things sometimes. He explains Schultz's words sometimes, like, oh, well, what Andrew is saying is, like, oh, okay. Now I get it. So, yeah, good job there. Good job to have him on, because he doesn't rein in Schultz, but explains his outbursts sometimes in a more logical way, which I think helps the audience to then not just hate on Andrew, like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, go like, oh, okay, yeah, now I get it. Last member of the team, Alex Media. Alex Media started as the observer behind the scenes, the media guy, but now he's like also on the sofa giving takes. And he's like the non-comedian there. He's also funny at times, of course, but he's like the non-stand-up comedian. And the most quiet one of the four, I think that's also like on purpose, of course. Less observer than before, so now, of course, active part of the team, but still in a more observing role. And like, if he says something, you're like, oh, what is Alex saying now? At least it used to be the case until sometimes he just... Also, he tries to Schultz it sometimes. But generally speaking, he's a bit quieter, a bit more observational, and that's what adds a different layer to it compared to, well, the moderator Mark, but I know like the outburst that Schultz has, and then Akash taking the Schultz points and taking them further. So he's got like this, he checks Andrew sometimes, especially on cultural topics. When Andrew talks about the black community, because Andrew apparently grew up in New York, and it's like, I know the black community, but Alex actually is black. So he's like, oh, wait, let me just check you right there. So that's nice sometimes. And of course, he has like the more technical viewpoint of things. So when you talk tech, for example, I'd rather listen to Alex's point of view, especially when it comes to content creation and things like this, rather than someone who doesn't do it themselves, right? The theories that apply here are the style and dress up theory. I'm kidding. It's just because he's always the one who's like dressed to the guild. Is that how you say it? Like crazy dressed up usually. They always make fun of it. So the theories that I would apply here is, one is my favorite, the spiral of silence theory, because his engagement is very selective. And it's interesting because it also shows that when he gets involved, he thinks it's worth it. It's worth to now actually talk about it and worth to put himself out there with his opinion. So sometimes when there's like just some random topics that he's like, man, I don't care, then he just doesn't say anything about it. And like, oh, okay, I get it, yeah, whatever. But then when he breaks the silence, they're like, oh, okay, let's see what Alex has to say. At least that used to be the case. Now he also almost adds an opinion to almost everything now. So it's getting more comfortable in front of the camera, clearly. But still, like, he's the most quiet one. So then when he breaks the silence, you're like, oh, Alex says something. Let's see what he has to say. Very interesting point of view, I believe. Also, since he's the tech guy, finally I can add this theory, technological determinism. What does it mean? Well, because I think that the decision. So I'm using Alex now as an example for the whole media team, if they have one there at the Flagrant Podcast, Schultz Studios, whatever they call it, right? So Alex just the spearhead of all the media people. So because the media team, Alex, and whoever is involved there, they of course decide, like, how do we present the podcast? What kind of cuts do we have, for example? So how do we use technology to present the podcast, the whole episode? Which highlights do we cut out? All those things, right? What do we post where on the Reels, on YouTube Shorts? I don't know if they're doing TikTok. So that's their decision. And that determines how we understand the message that's being sent, right? Marshall McLuhan, as you know, once said the medium is the message, clearly. So that also leads to technological determinism. Because, you see, I'm excited because I haven't talked about this theory yet on the podcast, and I like the theory a lot because it simply tells us that technology determines our development, how we understand things in communication theories, media theories, right? So the channel that you consume the content on, of course, influences how you understand the content. As an example, if I send you the same message in a letter, you're like, why are you sending me a letter? What the hell is this? If I send it to you on a WhatsApp message, you're like, whatever, I can reply later, right? So a letter feels more serious, for example, or an email is more serious than like a WhatsApp message. Even so, it could contain the same content, so the medium is the message. So technological determinism then also means technology determines how we understand things and influences our understanding and then how we develop from that. So choosing on which platforms you see what kind of outtakes or which kind of highlights and how they edit it and what they emphasize and what they visualize and so on, and which captions are bold and whatnot is all part of technological determinism. Okay, so that's Alex's role and then the media team behind it, of course. Now we bring it all together, the interaction, group dynamics, and so on. And then they have various interaction styles, of course, right? One is like, okay, you present your topic. That's what we're doing right now, the high school presentation style. You do your topic. We react. Oh, wow. You do your topic. The rest reacts. Oh, wow. That's very interesting. I did not know that. Oh, okay. I think, epiphany. And then you move on to the next topic. And then they have, like, of course, that like busting balls with each other approach, obviously. Usually they make fun of either Andrew's haircut, but I mean, it's on purpose by now, so it's like all played out. Like Alex's dressing style or like what they did over the weekend. So they're busting balls with each other, obviously. And then, of course, they also have the interaction side with the guests, where then they all interact in different manners. Like either they're all ganging up on a guest, like with Whitney Cummings, where they like all ganged up on her for whatever reason. Or like Andrew is like the provocative one, and Akash is like, oh, I see the point of the guest, and then Mark is trying to be the moderator. So they switch the communication styles, of course, also based on what they talk about, based on the reaction that they're getting, as I explained earlier, right? One theory that applies here, to no surprise, when we talk about like group communication and things like this, we call it groupthink. There are different names for that theory, but I think groupthink might be the one that's like most familiar to the listeners right now. And if you're part of a group, right, for a longer time, as you also know from group project at high school, at university, whatever, or even at work, right, with your team, you all think alike after a while. And that sometimes leads to, also on the podcast, to a lack of diverse opinions, because we're all on the same wavelength. We like all agree on everything. We did this together. We went that together. We always spend time together. We know exactly how we think. Then you don't have that many diverse thoughts anymore. Even though your team, of course, is very diverse, but you've spent so much time together. You've been friends forever. You're just so much in sync that you don't get any other viewpoints in anymore. So I think that's like one thing that we can also see on the podcast, that like they're very much stuck in their own echo chamber by now. That echo chamber now being like successful comedians, successful podcasters that are definitely rich by now, pretty rich by now. So they can't relate to the normal audience anymore. Like Andrew Schulz has epiphanies like now, oh my God, it's so hard for poor people to actually live out. Like, yes. So, right. So you can see that they're like in their own echo chamber, they're secure, safe, high upper class filter bubble, and that they're not getting much information from outside of those filter bubbles, echo chambers, and they're just also regurgitating like what other influencers tell them, and so they don't get much information from the outside world, it seems. It wasn't the case, like, I know 2-3 years ago, when the podcast was still developing, but now that it's like so huge, and that they're also famous, and Andrew is a celebrity, obviously, hanging out with all the other celebrities on whatever islands. Allegedly, I'm just joking, okay? Hawaii, he always talks about like his Hawaii holidays when he goes surfing, so he's hanging out on islands. Whew. But they're clearly in this bubble, and I think it's getting more and more obvious with almost each episode that they're losing touch to the normal audience, which is a little bit concerning. What I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, it's a little bit concerning that they're losing touch, which is then again very understandable with your tight-knit group, and you're getting more and more successful, and you're moving up the ranks of success, the hierarchy of success, so to speak. Then of course you're losing touch to what you leave behind at some point, right? there should be a way though to avoid like the just leveling up and forgetting where you're coming from, right? I think that's a big risk. And like if you look at like some theories here, like we could look at the cultivation theory, because like as you know now, cultivation theory, prolonged exposure to similar views may distort like your perception of like other opinions. So if they're all exposed to the same views all the time, to their upper class, fancy ass, New York, whatever is like the fancy district where they live, view, then they all agree with this point of view because they're exposed to it all the time, and they forget like the normal people's point of view, right? So that could also be like cultivation theory. You're cultivating your point of view. And the other one that I thought fits here would be the public sphere theory, because obviously the podcast is in the public, right? Even though they have one episode on Patreon still, but like one episode per week is in the public. And so podcasts or anything that's in the public has the ability to foster like a diverse public sphere. And hence there is a need for like inclusivity, different kinds of opinions, and so on. Now, if they don't bring that, then maybe it's just a negative or like not as much of a positive addition to the public sphere as it used to be, maybe. Okay, not hating on it, because I'm saying it's totally understandable why it happens. I just think there could be mechanisms in place that could maybe help the podcast hosts to prevent this from happening if they would want to focus on other opinions than their own, and if they would want to add more to the public sphere rather than just keep their very cozy bubble to themselves. And that's what I'm trying to say. Okay, that's been enough. Now I'm almost lecturing already, so I think it's time to wrap things up. So I hope it made a little bit of sense to see like how those different communication styles play with each other, and how they try to connect those, and how they try to engage with audience and so on. And I hope it didn't look like I'm just hating, because I used to be a big fan. Now I don't tune in that often anymore. I did now prepare for this episode again, of course, and I catch like, of course, parts of the episodes here and there, but I'm not like, oh, Flagrant is up, let's listen to it. I just watch it here and there when I have some free time at home. And so that's why I'm saying it, like there's so much potential there. They were so awesome with like all those cultural references and so on. You can see who follows them, for example, also online, I think mostly because of all those cultural references. And now seeing them to losing touch with the audience a little bit, it's like, you had it, and now it's slipping because you're too successful and you're in your bubble. So maybe just pulling them back in a little bit could help to like strengthen those ties again with communities, the culture, and so on. All right, that's it from me. Let me know what you think about the Flagrant podcast. Are you a fan? Have you been a fan, or were you a fan? Who's your favorite, and why is it Akash, or why is it? I didn't even talk about Darth right now, but because he's still off the camera. But yeah, so let me know what your thoughts are. Shout out in the comments at FlagrantPod on social media. Leave a review that really helps with the podcast reach. It would be fantastic. And as you know, stay safe, take care, and Sawadee Cup.